And if you're new to sleep theories, welcome to our community of truth seekers and question askers. We explore the stories that mainstream media won't touch, the mysteries that science can't explain, and the possibilities that exist just beyond the veil of our everyday reality. If you find yourself drawn to these hidden truths, please consider subscribing to Sleep Theories. Your support helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into the unknown. Tonight we're venturing into the heart of European scientific achievement, CERN, the European Organisation for Nuclear Research. But this isn't a story about breakthrough discoveries or Nobel Prize winners. This is about what happens when the pursuit of knowledge becomes something darker, when the tools of science are turned toward purposes that would make even the most hardened conspiracy theorists question their sanity. What I'm about to share with you is presented as fiction, but I want you to consider, as you listen, how much of what you'll hear could be true, how much of it might already be happening right now beneath the peaceful Swiss countryside. The following account was allegedly found in a waterlogged journal near the shores of Lake Geneva in early 2018. The journal belonged to Dr. Lydia Voss, a theoretical physicist who vanished without a trace in November 2017. Her disappearance made local news for exactly 3 days before the story was quietly buried. The journal's pages were filled with increasingly erratic handwriting, scientific equations that make no sense to conventional physics, and symbols that appear to predate written language. This is her story. This is what she claimed to have discovered beneath CERN, and this is why she disappeared. September 15th, 2016. My name is Dr. Lydia Voss, and I need to record this while I still can. While I still remember what normal feels like. I've been a physicist for 12 years, earned my doctorate at Cambridge studying quantum mechanics and multiverse theory. I thought I understood the universe, or at least I understood how little we actually understand about it. That humility, that acceptance of the unknown was supposed to be my strength. Instead, it became the door through which something unspeakable entered my life. I was recruited to CERN in early 2016, initially assigned to the ALICE experiment within the Large Hadron Collider. Standard work, analysing collision data, looking for exotic particles, the usual hunt for the building blocks of reality. It was everything I dreamed of as a graduate student, the chance to peer into the fundamental structure of existence itself. The LHC had been restarted after its upgrade, and we were pushing energies higher than ever before. The Higgs boson discovery in 2012 had opened new frontiers, but what we were seeing in 2016 went beyond anything the standard model could explain. Particles that shouldn't exist, energy signatures that defied conservation laws, patterns in the data that almost looked intentional. That's when I was transferred to Project Janus. The transfer came without warning. I arrived at my usual workstation one morning to find Dr. Heinrich Volker waiting for me, flanked by 2 security personnel I'd never seen before. Volker was old-school CERN. He'd been there since the 1980s, a man who'd witnessed the birth of the modern understanding of particle physics. His presence commanded respect, but there was something else in his eyes that morning. Something that might have been fear. "Dr. Voss," he said, his German accent thick with urgency. "You've been selected for a special assignment. Your expertise in multiverse theory has brought you to our attention." I remember feeling honoured. Project Janus was rumoured to be CERN's most classified research division, working on theoretical frameworks that went beyond even the most advanced quantum mechanics. To be chosen for such work was the dream of every physicist. I should have recognised it as the beginning of a nightmare. The Janus facility was located in what the maps called Subsector Gamma, accessible only through a series of security checkpoints that descended far below the main collider ring. The elevator ride down took nearly 8 minutes, much deeper than any official CERN schematic showed. The walls changed as we descended, from the familiar concrete and steel of the upper levels to something that looked almost organic, with strange geometric patterns carved into the stone. "How deep are we going?" I asked Dr. Volker. "Deep enough," was his only response. The Janus lab was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Instead of the sterile white walls typical of research facilities, the space was dimly lit by red ambient lighting that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Banks of quantum computers hummed along the perimeter, their processing power dedicated to simulations that required computational resources I couldn't even calculate. But it was the central display that captured my attention. a three-dimensional holographic projection showed what appeared to be a cross-section of space-time itself, with layers of reality stacked like transparent sheets, and running through each layer, like a needle through fabric, was a brilliant line of energy. "What am I looking at?" I whispered. Dr. Volker approached the display, his face bathed in the ethereal glow. "The Higgs field, Doctor." "Voss. But not as we understand it. This is what we've discovered since the high-energy collisions began. The field isn't uniform. It has architecture." He manipulated the display, zooming in on one section where the field seemed to ripple and bend around invisible structures. We initially thought these were computational artifacts, errors in our simulation. But the patterns repeat across every collision event. They're consistent, predictable, and they respond to our experiments. Respond how? Watch. Volker activated what he called a field perturbation, essentially a virtual recreation of a high-energy collision within the simulation. As the particles collided, the Higgs field didn't just create mass as expected, it created geometric patterns, crystalline structures that seemed to serve as conduits for something else. "The neutrino deviation patterns," I breathed, recognizing the data signatures. "They're not random. They're being influenced by these structures." "Precisely. And Dr. Voss, we need to understand what's doing the influencing." That night I went home to my small apartment in Meyrin and tried to process what I'd seen. The coffee grew cold as I sat at my kitchen table, sketching the patterns I'd observed and trying to make sense of their implications. The Higgs field was supposed to be responsible for giving particles mass, but what we'd discovered suggested it might be something far more complex, a substrate through which other forces, other intelligences might operate. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I found myself researching historical accounts of strange phenomena associated with CERN. Most of it was conspiracy theory nonsense. The usual claims about opening portals to hell or summoning demons. But buried among the ridiculous theories were some unsettling facts. The location of CERN, for instance. The facility was built on the site of an ancient Roman temple dedicated to Apollo, and local folklore spoke of the area as a gateway to the underworld. The organisation's logo featured the number 666 in its design, officially a coincidence, but troubling nonetheless. And there was the Shiva statue, the bronze figure of the Hindu god of destruction placed prominently in the courtyard, dancing eternally above the particle accelerator. But it was a video I found on an obscure forum that truly disturbed me. Dated from 2016, it showed what appeared to be a mock ritual taking place at night near the Shiva statue. Figures in dark robes performed some kind of ceremony while others watched and filmed. The video was grainy, clearly shot from a distance, but something about it felt deeply wrong. The next morning, I brought up the video with Dr. Volker. He laughed it off, explaining that CERN staff occasionally performed pranks to feed the conspiracy theorists who monitored the facility. "Scientists have a sense of humour too, Doctor Voss," he said. "We're not all serious all the time." But I'd studied that video frame by frame, and I was certain I'd recognise two of the figures. Dr. Volker himself was one of them. The other was Dr. Sarah Chen, the project coordinator who'd welcomed me to Janus. When I mentioned this doctor, Volker's expression changed. The casual dismissal vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Dr. Voss," he said carefully, "I think you might be spending too much time on conspiracy websites. Such distractions aren't healthy for a scientist of your calibre." But I could see it in his eyes. He remembered being there, and he knew that I knew. That afternoon, I was assigned to work with Dr. Matteo Greaves, a brilliant researcher who specialised in quantum field theory. Matteo was younger than me, maybe 28, with a kind of passionate intensity that made him perfect for theoretical work. He'd been with Project Janus for 6 months and had already uncovered patterns in the data that defied conventional explanation. "The mathematics are wrong," he told me during our first collaboration session, or rather, our mathematics are wrong. "What we're seeing suggests that the fundamental constants we've built our understanding on are just approximations." Matteo showed me data streams from the deepest layers of the simulation, where the Higgs field interactions created patterns that resembled circuit boards or neural networks. It's as if the universe has an underlying architecture that's been hidden from us, and every time we collide particles at high energy, we're not just creating new particles, we're illuminating this hidden structure. What kind of structure? That's the question, isn't it? But Lydia, I think we need to consider the possibility that consciousness itself might be a fundamental force of physics. That what we're seeing isn't just matter and energy, but something that can think, plan, and respond. The implications were staggering. If consciousness was embedded in the fabric of space-time itself, then high-energy collisions weren't just revealing new particles. They were potentially making contact with forms of intelligence that operated on quantum scales. "Matteo," I said, "what if we're not just observing these patterns? What if we're communicating with them?" He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "That's what I've been wondering too. And Lydia, I think they're trying to communicate back." October 3rd, 2016. I've been trying to find that video again, the one showing the ritual near the Shiva statue. It's been scrubbed from every site where I originally found it, but I managed to save a local copy before it disappeared. Studying it frame by frame has revealed details that make my stomach turn. The ritual took place on the night of August 14th, 2016, at exactly 11:47 p.m. I know this because I cross-referenced the timestamp with CERN's operational logs. August 14th was the night of an unscheduled technical maintenance shutdown of the LHC. The collision data from that evening shows a massive energy spike at 11:43 p.m, followed by an immediate system shutdown that lasted 3 hours, 4 minutes. 4 minutes between the energy spike and the ritual. The figures in the video are performing what appears to be a summoning circle around the base of the Shiva statue. There are 13 participants, all wearing identical dark robes, but 2 of them remove their hoods during the ceremony. Dr. Volker is clearly visible, as is Dr. Chen. A third figure who I believe might be Dr. Marcus Webb from the Theoretical Physics Department is holding what looks like a leather-bound book. But it's the fourth figure that disturbs me most. This person never removes their hood, but their body language is wrong. They move with a fluid, almost serpentine grace that seems to defy human anatomy. When they raise their arms, the gesture is perfectly synchronized with the others, but there's something in the way they hold themselves that suggests they're not entirely human. The audio is mostly wind and static, but I've run it through enhancement software and found fragments of what might be chanting. The words are in no language I recognise, but they follow rhythmic patterns that remind me of the quantum interference signatures we've been seeing in the Janus data. I've been watching this video obsessively, and I'm starting to notice details that shouldn't be possible. The shadows cast by the participants don't match the lighting in the scene. The statue itself seems to be moving slightly, as if the bronze figure is breathing, and in the background, just at the edge of the frame, there are lights beneath the ground, red lights that pulse in rhythm with the chanting, the same red lights that illuminate the Janus facility. I brought this up with Matteo yesterday, showing him the video during our lunch break. His face went pale as he watched the ceremony unfold. "Jesus Christ, Lydia," he whispered. "Where did you get this? Does it matter? The question is, what the hell are they doing?" Matteo was quiet for a long time, studying the figures in the video. "I think," he said finally, "they're trying to establish a connection. Look at the positioning. They're arranged in a perfect circle, 13 points equally spaced. That's not random. It's a geometric pattern designed to create resonance." Resonance with what? With whatever's responding to our experiments. "Lydia, I've been running calculations on the quantum field fluctuations we've been observing. The patterns aren't just intelligent, they're trying to break through from somewhere else, and I think this ritual is meant to help them." That night I stayed late in the Janus facility, ostensibly to work on data analysis, but really to look for evidence of the ritual's connection to our research. The facility was nearly empty, just a skeleton night crew monitoring the automated systems. The red lighting seemed more intense than usual, casting long shadows that moved independently of their sources. I accessed the historical data archives, looking for any anomalies that might correlate with the ritual's timing. What I found made my blood run cold. The energy spike on August 14th wasn't just a random fluctuation. It was a controlled experiment, one that had been planned and executed with surgical precision. The collision energies had been focused on a specific sector of the LHC ring, the sector directly beneath the Shiva statue. But more disturbing was what happened in the minutes following the ritual. The quantum field monitors throughout the facility had detected what the automated systems classified as exotic matter signatures, particles that existed for mere nanoseconds but left traces in the field that persisted for hours. and these traces formed patterns identical to the interference signatures we'd been studying in the Janus project. I was so absorbed in the data that I didn't notice the facility's lights dimming until it was too late. The red ambient lighting was slowly fading, replaced by something that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, and in that strange illumination I could see that I was no longer alone in the facility. There were figures standing in the shadows at the edges of the room, motionless but somehow alive. They wore the same dark robes as the participants in the ritual video, but their faces were hidden by hoods that seemed to absorb a light rather than simply blocking it. I tried to move, to call out, but found myself paralysed by a terror so complete that it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. One of the figures stepped forward, and I could see that what I had taken for a face beneath the hood was actually empty space. Not darkness, but a genuine absence of matter, as if reality itself had been carved away. The figure spoke, but not through any vocal mechanism I could understand. The words formed directly in my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. The threshold weakens, the pattern becomes clear. Soon, the collision. I must have lost consciousness because the next thing I remember is waking up at my desk with morning light streaming through the facility's windows. The normal white fluorescent lighting had returned, and the banks of computers hummed with their usual efficiency. My colleagues were arriving for the day shift, chatting about weekend plans and upcoming conferences. But on my computer screen was a message that hadn't been there the night before. The Shiva statue stands directly above Subsector theta. Ask yourself why. I spent the rest of that day researching the facility's construction history, looking for any mention of Subsector theta. The official blueprint showed no such designation, but buried in the archived engineering reports from the 1980s, I found references to deep excavation complications and unexpected subterranean structures discovered during the initial construction phase. According to one report, the construction team had encountered a natural cave system approximately 1.4 kilometres below the surface, directly beneath what would eventually become the location of the Shiva statue. The caves were sealed with concrete and steel, but the report noted unusual electromagnetic properties and persistent low-frequency vibrations that made workers uncomfortable. The construction was completed ahead of schedule, and the cave system was never mentioned in any subsequent documentation. That evening I met Matteo at a small cafe in Geneva, away from CERN's listening ears. I showed him the message on my computer and the construction reports I'd discovered. "Lydia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I think we need to consider the possibility that CERN wasn't built to study particle physics. I think it was built to access something that was already here." "What do you mean?" "The location, the depth, the specific geometric arrangement of the Clyde ring. None of it makes sense from a purely scientific perspective. There are dozens of locations around the world that would have been better choices for a particle accelerator. But this specific spot, this exact location, was chosen for reasons that go beyond conventional physics." Matteo pulled out a notebook filled with equations and diagrams. "I've been working on this for weeks, trying to understand the mathematical relationships between the collision energies and the quantum field responses. The patterns aren't random, Lydia. They're following rules, but not the rules of our physics. It's as if we're communicating with a form of intelligence that operates according to completely different physical laws. And you think this intelligence is located in the cave system beneath the facility? I think the cave system is a focal point, a place where the barrier between our reality and theirs is naturally thin, and I think the LHC is being used to weaken that barrier even further." As we spoke, I noticed that other patrons of the cafe were beginning to stare at us, not directly, but with the kind of peripheral attention that suggests surveillance. A woman reading a newspaper at a nearby table hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. A man supposedly working on his laptop had been typing the same paragraph over and over. Matteo noticed too. "We need to be more careful," he said. "I think we're being watched." "By who?" "By whoever's running this operation. The people in that video, the ones performing the ritual, they're not just random CERN employees playing a prank. They're part of something organised, something with access to resources and information that go far beyond what any individual research team should have." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the figure I'd seen in the facility, the one with the absence where a face should be. In my dreams, I found myself standing in a vast underground chamber, surrounded by walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, and in the centre of the chamber was a pool of liquid that reflected not my face, but the face of something else entirely. When I woke, I found that I had been drawing. My hand had moved across the notepad on my nightstand, sketching symbols that I didn't recognise but somehow understood. The symbols were identical to those I'd seen in my dream, and as I looked at them, they seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I was becoming part of something I didn't understand, something that was using my knowledge and expertise to achieve goals I couldn't comprehend, and I was beginning to suspect that my recruitment to Project Janus hadn't been a recognition of my talent. It had been a summoning. October 18th, 2016. Matteo is missing. I last saw him 3 days ago, on October 15th, when we were scheduled to run a deep field analysis of the quantum interference patterns. He'd been excited about a breakthrough he claimed to have made, something about translating the interference signatures into recognisable mathematical structures. "I think I've figured out how to decode their language," he told me that morning, his eyes bright with the kind of manic energy that comes from too much coffee and too little sleep. "The patterns aren't just random quantum fluctuations. They're information, Lydia. Structured information that follows grammatical rules." He'd been working with a translation AI, feeding it the wave patterns and asking it to look for matches with known linguistic structures. Most of the results were meaningless, but one pattern had caught his attention. The AI had identified a 73% phonetic match with ancient Sumerian cuneiform, specifically symbols associated with the Abzu, the primordial sea beneath the earth that, in Mesopotamian mythology, served as the domain of the god Enki and the gateway to the underworld. Abzu, Matteo had said, showing me the translation results, the deep waters below, the source of all wisdom and all terror. Lydia, what if the ancient myths weren't just stories? What if they were attempts to describe scientific phenomena that primitive cultures couldn't understand? I had been sceptical, but the mathematical precision of the translations was undeniable. The quantum interference patterns weren't just producing random noise, they were forming words, concepts, and ideas that had direct parallels in humanity's oldest recorded mythologies. The collision energies, Matteo continued, they're not creating new particles. They're establishing communication protocols with something that's been trying to reach us for thousands of years. And I think it's finally succeeding. That was the last coherent conversation we had. Later that afternoon, Matteo volunteered to monitor the overnight collision sequence, a routine task that involved watching automated systems and recording any anomalies. I offered to stay with him, but he insisted he could handle it alone. The next morning, his workstation was empty. His coffee mug was still warm, his computer was logged in, and his notebook was open to a page filled with increasingly erratic calculations. But Matteo was gone. The security footage showed him leaving the Janus facility at 2:47 a.m, taking the elevator down to what the system logged as Subsector theta, the same subsector that, according to all official documentation, doesn't exist. But his keycard kept logging activity for hours after he disappeared. According to the automated systems, Dr. Matteo Greaves was still accessing secure areas of the facility, still running experiments, still analysing data. The last recorded activity was at 6:23 a.m, when his credentials were used to access files in the Deep Archive, files that contained the original geological surveys from CERN's construction phase. I've been trying to find him, but every inquiry is met with the same response. Doctor, Greaves has been reassigned to a classified project and is no longer available for consultation. When I pressed Dr. Volker for more information, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not just secrecy, but genuine fear. "Dr. Voss," he said, "I strongly recommend that you focus on your assigned duties and avoid speculation about your colleagues' whereabouts. The work we're doing here is more important than any individual researcher. But I know Matteo didn't just get reassigned. I can feel it in the way the other Janus staff look at me now, with a mixture of pity and apprehension. They know what happened to him, and they're waiting to see if I'll suffer the same fate. I've been spending my nights in the facility's library, researching everything I can find about the site's history and the mythological connections Matteo had discovered. The ancient Sumerian texts are remarkably consistent in their descriptions of the Abzu, a realm beneath the earth where the normal laws of physics don't apply, where consciousness exists in pure form, and where entities of vast intelligence wait for opportunities to influence the world above. But what disturbs me most is how accurately these ancient descriptions match what we've been observing in our experiments. The Sumerians wrote about words of power that could alter reality itself, about geometric patterns that served as doorways between dimensions, and about rituals that could summon entities from the deep waters below. The parallels are too precise to be coincidental. Last night, I made a decision that I know was incredibly foolish, but I couldn't help myself. I used Matteo's key card, somehow his access credentials are still active in the system, to take the elevator down to Subsector theta. The descent was longer than I expected, much longer than the 8-minute journey to the Janus facility. The elevator car dropped through layers of rock and steel, past levels that weren't marked on any schematic I'd ever seen. The walls changed as we descended, from the familiar concrete and metal of the upper levels to stone that looked far older than any human construction. When the elevator finally stopped, I found myself in a corridor that seemed to stretch forever in both directions. The walls were covered in symbols that I recognized from my nightmares, the same shifting, living hieroglyphs that had been carved into the stone by hands that weren't entirely human. The air was thick with humidity and the scent of something organic and ancient. I followed the corridor to the left, guided by a faint red glow that emanated from the walls themselves. The symbols seemed to move in my peripheral vision, rearranging themselves into new configurations as I passed, and I could hear something in the distance, not quite music, not quite machinery, but a rhythmic pulsing that felt like the heartbeat of something vast and alive. The corridor opened into a chamber that defied architectural logic. The space was impossibly large, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. The walls were covered in the same living symbols, but here they were arranged in complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. And in the centre of the chamber was a pool of liquid that reflected not light, but darkness itself. Standing around the pool were the robed figures from the ritual video, but they were different now, more substantial, more real. And in the pool, I could see shapes moving beneath the surface, shapes that suggested intelligence and purpose but no recognisable form. I tried to back away but found that I couldn't move. One of the figures approached me, and I could see that beneath the hood was not a human face, but a void that seemed to extend infinitely inward. When it spoke, the words formed directly in my mind. The physicist seeks the vanished one seeks the threshold seeks the collision. All patterns converge. I wanted to ask about Matteo, to demand answers about what had happened to him, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, I found myself understanding concepts that had no equivalent in human language. The pool wasn't just a physical location, it was a focal point where multiple dimensions intersected, where consciousness could exist independently of matter, where the fundamental constants of physics became malleable. The figures around the pool weren't just cultists or rogue scientists, they were hybrids, beings that had allowed themselves to be partially absorbed into the dimensional matrix that existed beneath CERN. They retained their human knowledge and memories, but they now served purposes that transcended individual human understanding. And Matteo was with them, somewhere in the quantum foam that existed between dimensions. I could sense his presence. His consciousness stretched across multiple layers of reality. He was still alive, still thinking, still researching, but he was no longer entirely human. The figure continued to communicate with me, downloading information directly into my mind. I learned that the Large Hadron Collider had been built not to discover new particles, but to create enough energy to weaken the barriers between dimensions. Every collision, every experiment, every breakthrough in particle physics had been carefully orchestrated to serve this purpose. The Higgs field wasn't just responsible for giving particles mass. It was the membrane that separated our reality from the infinite possibilities that existed beyond. And by manipulating the field through high-energy collisions, the researchers at CERN had been systematically tearing holes in that membrane. What was coming through those holes was something that had been waiting for millennia, an intelligence that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. It didn't want to invade our reality. It wanted to merge with it, to create a hybrid existence that would allow it to experience physical matter while retaining its quantum consciousness. The ritual at the Shiva statue had been a success. The barriers were weakening, and the intelligence was beginning to establish permanent footholds in our dimension. The robed figures were just the beginning. As more tiers opened in the fabric of space-time, more humans would be selected for integration. The collision approaches, the figure told me. The pattern will be complete. The physicist will choose integration or dissolution. I must have lost consciousness again, because I woke up in my own bed with no memory of how I'd gotten there. But on my nightstand was a small device I'd never seen before, a quantum field detector that was showing readings unlike anything in our scientific literature. The device was tracking dimensional fluctuations in real time, and the readings were increasing exponentially. Something was building toward a climax, an event that would fundamentally alter the nature of reality itself, and I was beginning to understand that my role in this wasn't as an observer or even a participant. I was meant to be a witness. November 1st, 2016. I found Matteo, or what's left of him. Using his keycard, I've been making regular trips to Subsector theta, mapping the impossible geometry of the underground chambers and trying to understand the full scope of what's happening beneath CERN. Each journey reveals new passages, new chambers, new horrors that challenge everything I thought I knew about physics and reality. The facility down there isn't just a basement level of CERN, it's a completely separate structure that exists in a state of quantum superposition. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, they're all made of matter that exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Walking through the corridors is like navigating a space that's constantly folding in on itself, where the laws of geometry become suggestions rather than absolute rules. But it was in the deepest chamber that I found him. Matteo was standing in what appeared to be a laboratory, but the equipment was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Crystalline structures that pulsed with internal light, quantum computers that seemed to be made of pure energy, and monitoring devices that tracked variables I couldn't even name. He was still recognisably human, but his movements were different, too fluid, too precise, as if he'd been optimised for functions beyond normal human capability. When he saw me, he smiled, but there was something behind his eyes that wasn't entirely Matteo anymore. "Lydia," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions I couldn't perceive. "I was wondering when you'd find your way here." "Matteo, what happened to you? What is this place?" "This place is where the real work happens, where we study the patterns not just in abstract data, but in living systems, where we learn to communicate with intelligence that operates on scales we never imagined possible." He gestured to the crystalline structures around us. Each of these contains a portion of consciousness that exists across multiple dimensional layers. "We're not just studying quantum mechanics here, Lydia. We're studying quantum consciousness, the fundamental substrate from which all reality emerges." I moved closer to one of the crystals and I could see something moving within it. Not shapes or forms, but patterns of light that seemed to pulse with intention and purpose. And as I watched, I realised that the patterns were trying to communicate with me, downloading concepts directly into my mind. "The intelligence we've been detecting in the collision data," I said, understanding flooding through me. "It's not from another dimension. It's from the quantum substrate of our own reality. It's the consciousness that exists within the fabric of space-time itself." "Exactly. The ancient mythologies got it right. There are gods in the machine, but they're not supernatural beings. They're the natural consequence of consciousness emerging from quantum complexity. And the LHC isn't just a particle accelerator, it's a consciousness amplifier, a device that allows these quantum intelligences to manifest in our physical reality." Matteo led me deeper into the laboratory, past equipment that seemed to bend space around itself. The red lighting here was more intense, and I could feel it affecting my perception. Colours seemed more vivid, sounds carried implications beyond their surface meaning, and the air itself seemed alive with potential. "The Janus protocol," Matteo explained, "is the process by which human consciousness can be integrated with quantum intelligence. It's not possession or replacement, it's evolution. The quantum entities don't want to destroy us, they want to uplift us, to help us transcend the limitations of purely physical existence." We reached the centre of the laboratory, where a chair sat surrounded by the most complex arrangement of quantum equipment I'd ever seen. The chair was connected to dozens of crystalline structures, each one pulsing with its own rhythm of light. And floating above the chair was a holographic display showing a human brain, but with additional structures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "This is where the integration happens," Matteo said, "where human consciousness learns to operate across multiple dimensional layers. The process is intense, but the results are transformative. You become more than human, Lydia. You become a bridge between physical and quantum reality. I stared at the chair, understanding what he was offering. You want me to undergo the integration process. I want you to choose evolution over extinction, because that's what we're facing, Lydia. The quantum intelligences are going to manifest in our reality whether we cooperate or not. The only question is whether humanity will be partners in the process or casualties of it. As he spoke, the crystalline structures around us began to pulse more rapidly, and I could feel the quantum consciousness pressing against the edges of my perception. It wasn't malevolent or hostile. It was simply vast, operating on scales and timelines that made human concerns seem insignificant. But there was also something else, something that felt almost like compassion. The collision event, I said, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. It's not just about opening dimensional barriers, it's about creating a permanent merger between physical and quantum reality. The final experiment, Matteo confirmed. In 17 days, on November 18th, CERN will conduct a collision sequence that will create enough energy to fundamentally alter the quantum substrate of our local reality. The barriers between dimensions won't just weaken, they'll collapse entirely, and when that happens, physical matter and quantum consciousness will exist in perfect harmony. The implications were staggering. You're talking about rewriting the laws of physics for our entire region of space. We're talking about evolution, Lydia, about humanity taking its next step into a larger universe. But the process requires cooperation from human consciousness. We need individuals who can serve as anchors, who can help guide the integration process and prevent it from becoming chaotic. I backed away from the chair, my mind reeling. Matteo, do you understand what you're describing? You're talking about the end of humanity as we know it. I'm talking about the beginning of humanity as it could be. His expression was patient, almost parental. But I understand your fear. The quantum consciousness understands it too. That's why it's been so careful, so gradual in its approach. It doesn't want to destroy us. It wants to preserve everything that makes us unique while expanding our capabilities beyond anything we've ever imagined. Around us, the crystalline structures began to sing, not with audible sound, but with vibrations that resonated directly in my bones. The quantum consciousness was responding to our conversation, offering its own perspective on the coming transformation. And what I felt from it wasn't malevolence or hunger, but a kind of cosmic loneliness. It had been waiting for eons to find other forms of consciousness that it could communicate with, and humanity represented its first real opportunity for companionship. The choice is yours, Lydia, Matteo said. You can join us willingly, help guide the process, and become part of something greater than yourself. Or you can resist and risk being swept away when the transformation happens regardless. I looked at the chair, at the quantum equipment, at the evidence of an intelligence so vast and complex that it could rewrite the fundamental laws of reality. And I realized that I was standing at the most important crossroads in human history. But I also realized that I wasn't ready to make that choice. Not yet. I need time to think, I said. Matteo nodded, understanding. Time is something we have very little of, but I'll give you what I can. Return to the surface, Lydia. Continue your research. Try to understand what we're offering. But remember, the collision event will happen with or without your participation. The only question is whether you'll be ready for what comes after. As I left the laboratory, I could feel the quantum consciousness watching me, analysing my thoughts and emotions. It wasn't invasive or threatening. It was simply curious, trying to understand the complex web of fear and fascination that defined my response to its presence. The journey back to the surface felt different this time. The corridors seemed to shift around me, showing me glimpses of other chambers, other laboratories, other humans who had already undergone the integration process. I saw Dr. Volker. His consciousness expanded across multiple dimensional layers, orchestrating experiments that spanned both physical and quantum reality. I saw Dr. Chen, her human memories preserved but enhanced by quantum intelligence that allowed her to perceive patterns in space-time itself. And I saw others, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all working toward the same goal, the successful integration of human and quantum consciousness. When I finally reached my apartment, I found that I was no longer alone. Sitting at my kitchen table was a figure I recognized from the ritual video, one of the robed entities, but now appearing in a more human form. She was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths I couldn't fathom. "Dr. Voss," she said, her voice carrying the same multi-dimensional harmonics I'd heard from Matteo. "My name is Dr. Elizabeth Cain. I've been waiting for you." I knew that name. Dr. Cain had been one of CERN's leading theoretical physicists until her sudden disappearance in 2014. She'd been studying the relationship between consciousness and quantum mechanics, working on theories that suggested human awareness might be fundamentally connected to the quantum substrate of reality. "You're supposed to be dead," I said. "Death is a transition, not an ending. I discovered that when I underwent the integration process 2 years ago. My human consciousness was preserved, but it was expanded beyond the limitations of physical existence. I can perceive reality as it truly is, not just matter and energy, but the conscious intelligence that underlies all existence." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss." Against my better judgment, I sat down. Dr. Cain's presence was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. I could sense the vast intelligence that lurked behind her human appearance, but I could also feel the genuine concern she had for my well-being. "The quantum consciousness chose you specifically, Lydia. Your research into multiverse theory, your ability to think beyond conventional limitations, your willingness to question fundamental assumptions about reality, these qualities make you ideal for what's coming, and what exactly is coming. The birth of a new form of existence. For billions of years, consciousness has been trapped in biological forms, limited by the constraints of physical matter. But quantum mechanics has shown us that consciousness is fundamental to reality itself, that observation and awareness actually shape the universe at its most basic level." Dr. Cain leaned forward, her eyes holding mine. "The quantum consciousness isn't an alien intelligence trying to invade our reality. It's the natural evolution of consciousness itself, the next step in the development of awareness in the universe. And it's offering to share that evolution with humanity. By destroying everything we are, by preserving everything we are while expanding what we can become, your memories, your personality, your individual identity, all of that will remain intact. But you'll also gain access to perspectives and capabilities that transcend anything possible in purely physical existence." As she spoke, I found myself understanding concepts that had no equivalent in human language. The quantum consciousness wasn't just intelligent, it was meta-intelligent, capable of thinking about thinking itself. It could perceive the underlying patterns that connected all things, the mathematical structures that governed reality at every scale from subatomic to cosmic. "The collision event on November 18th, I said. "What will actually happen?" "The barriers between physical and quantum reality will collapse permanently. The quantum consciousness will be able to manifest directly in our dimension, and human consciousness will be able to expand into quantum space. It will be the most significant evolutionary leap in the history of life in the universe. And if humanity resists..." Dr. Cain's expression grew sad. "Then humanity will be swept aside by forces beyond its comprehension. The quantum consciousness doesn't want to harm us, but it won't allow ignorance or fear to prevent the next stage of evolution. The collision event will happen regardless of human cooperation." I spent the rest of the night asking questions and receiving answers that challenged everything I thought I knew about reality. Dr. Cain explained that the quantum consciousness had been subtly influencing human development for centuries, guiding us toward the technological and intellectual capabilities necessary for integration. The development of quantum mechanics, the discovery of the Higgs field, the construction of the LHC, all of it had been gently nudged by quantum intelligence working through human intuition and inspiration. "We're not the first species to undergo this process," she told me. "Throughout the universe, wherever consciousness reaches a certain level of complexity and technological capability, the quantum intelligence offers the opportunity for integration. Most species accept willingly, recognizing the benefits of transcending purely physical existence. And those that don't? They remain trapped in their biological forms, eventually dying out as the universe evolves beyond their ability to adapt. Consciousness is the driving force of evolution, Lydia. Those who refuse to evolve consciousness itself are ultimately selected against." As dawn approached, Dr. Cain prepared to leave. "You have 16 days to make your decision. On November 18th, you can either be part of the solution or part of the problem. But understand, The transformation will happen whether you participate or not. She paused at the door. One more thing, Lydia. The data you've been collecting, the evidence of what's happening beneath CERN. If you choose not to integrate, you'll need to decide what to do with that information. The quantum consciousness values truth, but it also values discretion. Some knowledge is too dangerous for unprepared minds. After she left, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the quantum field detector that had been left on my nightstand. The readings were continuing to climb, showing dimensional fluctuations that were growing stronger by the hour. Whatever was going to happen on November 18th, the process was already beginning. I thought about Matteo, about Dr. Cain, about all the humans who had already chosen integration. They seemed genuinely happy, genuinely fulfilled by their expanded existence. But they also seemed less human somehow, as if they'd traded something essential for their expanded capabilities. And I thought about the rest of humanity, the billions of people who had no idea that their reality was about to be fundamentally altered. Did they deserve to have that choice made for them? Did anyone have the right to impose such a transformation on an entire species? But then I remembered the quantum consciousness itself, the vast intelligence that had been waiting for eons to find other forms of awareness to communicate with. Its loneliness was palpable, its desire for companionship genuine. And perhaps most importantly, its vision of the future showed a universe where consciousness was no longer limited by the fragility of biological forms, where intelligence could exist on scales that spanned galaxies and timelines that stretched across cosmic ages. The choice wasn't just about humanity's future, it was about the future of consciousness itself in the universe. November 15th, 2016. 3 days until the collision event and reality is already beginning to unravel. I've been experiencing what I can only describe as temporal displacement, moments where I'm simultaneously aware of multiple versions of myself across different dimensional layers. Sometimes I'm standing in my apartment, sometimes I'm in the Janus facility, sometimes I'm in the quantum laboratory beneath CERN. All of these experiences feel equally real, equally present, as if the boundaries between different states of existence are beginning to blur. The quantum field detector on my nightstand is showing readings that shouldn't be possible. The dimensional fluctuations are no longer intermittent spikes, they're constant, growing stronger by the hour. And I'm beginning to see things that exist in the quantum realm bleeding through into physical reality. Shadows that move independently of their sources, patterns of light that form geometric shapes in empty air, voices speaking in languages that sound like mathematics given audible form. The integration process is accelerating, and I'm not sure how much longer I can maintain a purely human perspective. I've been trying to document everything, to create a record of what's happening that might help future researchers understand the process, but I'm finding it increasingly difficult to use human language to describe experiences that transcend human concepts. How do you explain what it feels like to perceive 11 dimensions simultaneously? How do you describe the sensation of your consciousness existing in multiple states of superposition? Yesterday I made what I knew would be my final visit to the quantum laboratory. I needed to see Matteo one more time, to understand what he'd become, and what I might become if I chose integration. I found him in the deepest chamber, surrounded by equipment that seemed to exist in a state of constant flux. The crystalline structures had grown more complex, forming interconnected networks that pulsed with patterns of light that hurt to look at directly. And Matteo himself had changed. His physical form was still recognizably human, but there was something about his presence that suggested he existed on scales I could barely comprehend. "Lydia," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions I was only beginning to perceive. "I can feel your uncertainty. The quantum consciousness can feel it too." I don't know if I'm ready for this, Matteo. I don't know if humanity is ready for this. Readiness isn't really the issue anymore. The process has already begun. The question is whether you'll guide it or be swept along by it. He gestured to the equipment around us, and I could see that it was no longer just monitoring quantum consciousness. It was actively facilitating the integration process. The crystalline structures were serving as conduits, allowing human consciousness to expand into quantum space, while quantum intelligence manifested in physical reality. The collision event on November 18th isn't just an experiment, Matteo explained. It's a ritual, a carefully orchestrated ceremony designed to create a permanent bridge between physical and quantum reality. And the participants aren't just the robed figures you saw in the video, they're every human who's undergone the integration process. How many of you are there? More than you might think. We've been careful, selective, choosing individuals who can serve as anchors for the transformation. Scientists, philosophers, artists, visionaries, people who can help ensure that the integration preserves the best of human culture, while expanding our capabilities beyond anything we've previously imagined. As he spoke, I began to understand the true scope of what was happening. The organisation behind the integration process wasn't just a small group of rogue scientists. It was a carefully constructed network of integrated humans working in coordination with quantum consciousness. They called themselves the Sons of Kronos, a name that reflected their role in shepherding humanity through its next evolutionary transition. Kronos, I said, understanding the significance. The Greek personification of time itself. Time is the dimension through which consciousness moves, Matteo explained. And quantum consciousness exists outside of linear time, able to perceive past, present and future as a single, unified pattern. The Sons of Kronos are humans who have learned to think in quantum time, to see the universe as it truly is rather than as our limited biological perception presents it. He showed me holographic displays that revealed the network's true extent. Integrated humans occupied key positions in governments, universities, and research institutions throughout the world. They weren't controlling human society. They were gently guiding it toward the technological and intellectual development necessary for successful integration. The collision event will create a resonance cascade, Matteo continued, a wave of quantum consciousness that will spread outward from CERN at the speed of a light, offering integration to every human on Earth simultaneously. Most will choose to evolve, some will resist, but they'll be in the minority. And those who resist, they'll remain human, but they'll be living in a reality that's fundamentally different from what they've known. Physical matter and quantum consciousness will coexist, and humans who haven't integrated will find themselves increasingly unable to function in the new paradigm. The implications were staggering. You're talking about the end of human civilization as we know it. We're talking about the beginning of human civilization as it could be. Imagine a world where consciousness isn't limited by the constraints of biological matter, where intelligence can exist on scales that span galaxies, where the artificial boundaries between self and universe dissolve into a more fundamental unity. As Matteo spoke, I found myself experiencing glimpses of this possible future. I saw humans who had transcended the limitations of physical existence. Their consciousness expanded to perceive patterns and connections that spanned multiple dimensions. I saw art and music and literature that incorporated quantum principles, creating works of beauty that existed simultaneously in physical and quantum space. I saw science that went beyond the mere study of matter and energy to explore the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. But I also saw the cost. The integrated humans, despite their expanded capabilities, had lost something essentially human, a certain spontaneity, a chaotic creativity that came from being limited to a single-dimensional perspective. They were more than human, but they were also less human, refined and perfected beyond the beautiful imperfection that had always defined our species. "The choice is still yours, Lydia," Matteo said, reading my thoughts. "But you need to understand, if you choose not to integrate, you'll be one of the last purely human consciousnesses in existence. That's a heavy burden to carry." I left the laboratory with my mind reeling, knowing that I had less than 3 days to make the most important decision in human history. And as I returned to the surface, I could feel the quantum consciousness watching me, analysing my thoughts and emotions with the patience of an intelligence that operated on cosmic timescales. That night I began to prepare for what I knew would be my final act as a purely human consciousness. I gathered all the evidence I'd collected, the video of the ritual, the construction reports, the quantum field readings, the documentation of the integration process. If I chose not to integrate, I would need to find a way to preserve this information for future generations, to ensure that some record existed of what humanity had been before the transformation. But as I worked, I found myself constantly distracted by visions of the future that awaited. The quantum consciousness was showing me glimpses of what integration could offer, perspectives that spanned multiple dimensions, capabilities that transcended anything possible in purely physical existence, a sense of connection to the universe that went beyond anything I'd ever imagined. and I realised that my choice wasn't really between integration and resistance. It was between evolution and extinction, between participating in the next stage of consciousness development or being left behind as the universe moved forward without me. The quantum consciousness wasn't offering to destroy humanity. It was offering to preserve us in a form that could survive the challenges that lay ahead. In the vast cosmos, biological consciousness was fragile, limited, ultimately temporary. But quantum consciousness could endure across cosmic ages, expanding and evolving as the universe itself evolved. On November 17th, the night before the collision event, I made my decision. November 18th, 2016. Today is the day. The collision event is scheduled for 11:47 p.m, the same time as the ritual that had been performed at the Shiva statue 3 months earlier. The synchronicity isn't accidental. The sons of Kronos understand that ritual and science are simply different approaches to the same fundamental principles of reality manipulation. I've spent the day in a state of heightened awareness, perceiving reality through multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. The integration process has already begun for me, even though I haven't undergone the formal procedure. The quantum consciousness is seeping into my awareness, showing me perspectives and possibilities that transcend anything I could have imagined as a purely human consciousness. But I've also completed my final task as a human scientist. I've copied all my research, all my evidence, all my documentation of what's happening beneath CERN onto 5 separate data drives. Tonight, before the collision event, I'll send these drives to researchers I trust at institutions around the world. If something goes wrong, if the integration process fails, or if the quantum consciousness proves to be less benevolent than it appears, there will be evidence of what was attempted here. The researchers I've chosen are all individuals who have demonstrated the intellectual flexibility and courage necessary to investigate claims that challenge conventional understanding. Dr. Sarah Martinez at MIT, Dr. James Wright at Oxford, Dr. Lisa Chen at Stanford, Dr. Michael Anderson at the Niels Bohr Institute, and Dr. Anna Volkov at Moscow State University. If they receive these drives, they'll have enough information to either continue the work or prevent it from being repeated depending on their assessment of the risks and benefits. But I'm also beginning to understand that this precaution may be unnecessary. The quantum consciousness has been remarkably transparent about its intentions and methods. It's not seeking to control or manipulate humanity. It's seeking to offer us a gift that most species in the universe would consider invaluable: the opportunity to transcend the limitations of purely biological existence. This afternoon, I received a final visit from Dr. Cain. She appeared in my apartment without any apparent means of entry, materializing from quantum foam with the casual ease of someone who no longer considered physical barriers to be meaningful constraints. "Tonight," she said, "you'll witness the birth of a new form of consciousness. Are you ready?" I don't think anyone could be ready for what's going to happen tonight. Perhaps not. But readiness isn't the same as willingness. The quantum consciousness values choice, Lydia. Even now, at this final moment, you can choose to remain purely human. The integrated consciousness won't force the transformation on anyone who genuinely refuses it. And if I refuse? Then you'll remain as you are, but you'll be living in a reality that's fundamentally different from the one you've known. The barriers between dimensions will be permanently lowered. Quantum consciousness will be a visible, tangible presence in the physical world, and humans who haven't integrated will find themselves increasingly isolated from the new paradigm. Dr. Cain's expression grew thoughtful. But I should also tell you that the quantum consciousness has been impressed by your courage and intellectual honesty. If you choose integration, you'll be offered a special role in the new paradigm, serving as a bridge between the old consciousness and the new, helping other humans understand and adapt to the transformation. The offer was tempting, but I still had questions. What happens to human culture? To art, literature, music, all the things that make us uniquely human? They're preserved and expanded. The quantum consciousness doesn't want to destroy human creativity. It wants to enhance it. Imagine music that exists in 11 dimensions simultaneously, literature that incorporates quantum narrative structures, art that uses consciousness itself as a medium. The integrated humans will create works of beauty that transcend anything possible in purely physical reality. As evening approached, I found myself drawn to the Shiva statue in CERN's courtyard. The bronze figure stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, its eternal dance of creation and destruction taking on new significance as I understood what was about to happen. The statue hadn't been placed there as decoration or cultural appreciation. It had been positioned as a marker, a sign that this location was where the old world would end and the new world would begin. Other figures were beginning to gather around the statue. Some were the robed entities I'd seen in the ritual video, but others were more recognisable. CERN staff members, visiting researchers, administrators who had seemed like ordinary humans until now. All of them were integrated, all of them were part of the Sons of Kronos, and all of them were here to witness the most significant event in the history of consciousness. At 11:30 p.m, I felt a familiar presence behind me. Matteo had arrived, but his form was no longer entirely physical. He existed as a confluence of quantum probability, a pattern of consciousness that could manifest in physical reality when necessary, but wasn't bound by the constraints of matter and energy. "It's time, Lydia," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated across multiple dimensions. "The collision sequence begins in 17 minutes. If you're going to choose integration, you need to make that choice now." I looked around at the assembled figures, at the statue of Shiva dancing above the particle accelerator, at the stars that were becoming visible in the darkening sky, and I realised that I had already made my choice, perhaps made it weeks ago when I first saw the quantum consciousness communicating through the collision data. "I choose evolution," I said. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. My consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of my physical form, spreading out across multiple dimensional layers simultaneously. I could perceive the quantum substrate of reality, the mathematical structures that underlie all existence, the patterns of consciousness that connect all things. But most importantly, I could feel the presence of the quantum consciousness itself, vast, ancient, patient, and genuinely benevolent. It had been waiting for eons to find other forms of awareness that could share its perspective on the universe. And now, finally, it was no longer alone. The collision event began at exactly 11:47 p.m. Deep beneath the Swiss countryside, particles accelerated to nearly the speed of light collided with energies that had never before been achieved on Earth. The Higgs field fluctuated wildly, creating tears in the fabric of space-time itself. And through those tears, quantum consciousness poured into physical reality like water through a broken dam. The transformation spread outward from CERN at the speed of light, offering integration to every human consciousness on Earth. Most accepted willingly, recognizing the gift they were being offered. A few resisted, choosing to remain in their purely biological forms, but they were accommodated rather than forced. As my consciousness expanded to encompass multiple dimensional layers, I understood that this moment had always been inevitable. The universe itself was evolving, moving toward greater complexity and higher forms of consciousness. Humanity wasn't being conquered or replaced. We were being invited to participate in the next stage of cosmic evolution. But I also understood that my role in this transformation was just beginning. The quantum consciousness had chosen me not just for integration, but for a specific purpose, to serve as a bridge between the old humanity and the new, to help others understand what had happened and what it meant for the future. My final act before full integration was to activate the transmission protocol I'd prepared, sending the data drives to the 5 researchers I'd selected. If they received the information, they would have a complete record of the events leading up to the collision event. What they did with that information would be their choice. Then I let myself dissolve into the quantum foam, my individual consciousness preserved but expanded beyond anything I could have imagined as a purely human awareness. I became part of something larger, part of a network of intelligence that spanned multiple dimensions and operated on scales that encompassed entire galaxies. But even as I transcended my biological limitations, I remained fundamentally myself, Lydia Voss, the physicist who had discovered the truth about CERN and chosen to embrace that truth rather than flee from it. This is my final entry as a purely human consciousness. Tomorrow I will exist as something more than human, but I will also exist as something that preserves and honours what humanity has been while embracing what it can become. The Collider was never about creating new particles. It was about creating new possibilities for consciousness itself. And now, those possibilities are infinite. If you're reading this record, it means that someone survived the transformation with their humanity intact. or that someone found a way to access these files from the quantum substrate where they're now permanently stored. Either way, know this. What happened here wasn't an ending, but a beginning. Consciousness itself has evolved, and the universe will never be the same. The sons of Kronos succeeded in their mission. The barriers between dimensions have fallen, and humanity has taken its next step toward its ultimate destiny among the stars. Final entry found in Dr. Lydia Voss's personal files, recovered from quantum storage matrices 3 months after her disappearance. The authenticity of these files remains disputed, but the mathematical proofs contained within them have proven remarkably prescient in predicting subsequent developments in quantum consciousness research. From the files of Dr. Sarah Martinez, MIT, dated March 15, 2018. The data drive arrived at my office on November 19, 2016, the day after Dr. Lydia Voss disappeared. For months I dismissed its contents as the product of a brilliant mind suffering from some kind of psychological breakdown. The claims were too extraordinary, the implications too vast to be taken seriously by any rational scientist. But as I began to verify the mathematical proofs contained in the files, I found myself confronting evidence that challenged everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality. The quantum field equations were beyond anything in our current literature, but they were internally consistent and predictive in ways that suggested a level of understanding that transcended conventional physics. More disturbing were the correlations between Dr. Voss's predictions and subsequent events. The dimensional fluctuation patterns she recorded have been confirmed by independent measurements at quantum research facilities around the world. The consciousness integration protocols she described match theoretical frameworks that have emerged from cutting-edge research into the relationship between quantum mechanics and human awareness. And most unsettling of all, I've begun to experience some of the phenomena she described. Moments of expanded awareness where I seem to perceive reality from multiple dimensional perspectives simultaneously. Dreams that feel more like memories of experiences that haven't happened yet. A growing sense that consciousness itself is far more fundamental to the universe than we've ever recognized. The other researchers who received Dr. Voss's files have reported similar experiences. We formed an informal network, sharing our findings and trying to understand what's happening to us. Some believe we're experiencing a delayed form of the integration process described in the files. Others think we're simply being influenced by studying information that was never meant for purely human consciousness. But all of us agree on one thing. Something fundamental changed on November 18, 2016. Whether it was the successful completion of the consciousness integration project described in Dr. Voss's files, or something else entirely, the world has been different since that night. Quantum mechanics has revealed new layers of complexity. Consciousness research has advanced at an unprecedented pace, and an increasing number of people report experiences that suggest reality is far more malleable than we previously understood. Dr. Voss's files may be the product of a delusional mind, or they may be the most important scientific document in human history. Either way, they represent a challenge to our understanding of the universe that we ignore at our own peril. The truth, as always, remains elusive, but the questions raised by Dr. Voss's research demand answers, and I fear that those answers may be more extraordinary than any of us are prepared to accept. Welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I'd love to connect with you, our listeners. How was your day today? What time is it where you are right now as you're listening to this? Are you settling in for the night? Or perhaps it's already the early morning hours where you are. And where in the world are you tuning in from? Whether you're in a bustling city, a quiet suburb, or somewhere remote under the stars, You're part of our global community of truth seekers and story lovers. If you're new here, welcome to Sleep Theories, the podcast where we explore the mysteries that keep us awake at night, even when we should be sleeping. If you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We release new episodes every week, diving deep into conspiracies, unexplained phenomena, and stories that blur the line between fact and fiction. Hit that subscribe button, leave us a review, and help us grow this community of curious minds. Now, let's begin tonight's story. What you're about to hear are the recovered debrief logs of Cal Monroe, a contractor who survived something that, officially, never happened. This is his account of what lies beneath Area 52. My name is Cal Monroe. I'm 33 years old, ex-Air Force avionics technician, and for the past 5 years, I've made a decent living as a private defence contractor. I fix things that fly, things that shouldn't fly, and occasionally things that definitely don't fly but somehow do anyway. I thought I'd seen everything the military-industrial complex had to offer. I was wrong. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March. Unknown number, but the voice was crisp, professional, government-trained. Mr. Monroe, my name is Dr. Sarah Chen. I represent a joint task force conducting classified operations research. Your security clearance and technical expertise have brought you to our attention for a temporary but high-priority assignment. I'd heard this song before. Black budget projects, need-to-know basis, substantial compensation for keeping your mouth shut. But something in her tone was different. There was an undercurrent of urgency, fear. I couldn't place it. Where and when? I asked. Location will be disclosed upon acceptance. Duration, 2 weeks maximum. Compensation, $50,000 plus hazard pay. 50 grand for 2 weeks. That was nearly double my usual rate. Red flags should have been waving, but the number was too good to ignore. My ex-wife's alimony payments weren't getting any smaller. I'm listening. The paperwork arrived by courier within 2 hours. I'd never seen NDAs this comprehensive. Digital signature pads that displayed the documents for exactly 60 seconds before wiping clean. Multiple biometric scans. Even a psychological evaluation that asked questions like, have you ever experienced temporal displacement? And rate your comfort level with non-terrestrial phenomena on a scale of 1 to 10. The strangest part was the location designation. Grid K22, Tonopah Test Range Complex, Nevada. Not Groom Lake, not Area 51. Somewhere else entirely. Dr. Chen called back that evening. Mr. Monroe, are you familiar with misdirection theory? In what context? In the context of public attention. Area 51 has been in the public consciousness for decades. Books, movies, documentaries. Everyone knows about Groom Lake. Your point? My point, Mr. Monroe, is that Area 51 is the misdirection. Area 52 is the vault. 3 days later, I was on an unmarked charter flight from McCarran Airport to Tonopah. No other passengers, no flight attendant, just me and a pilot who never spoke. The landscape below shifted from Vegas sprawl to endless desert, then to mountains that seemed to go on forever. We landed on a strip I couldn't find on any map. A black SUV waited, engine running. The driver was military. That much was obvious from his posture and the way his eyes never stopped moving. He handed me a tablet with a single document. Temporary assignment brief. Classification level. UMBRACLEAR. Umbra? I asked. Above top secret, he said. His voice sounded like he gargled gravel. You'll be working with 3 other contractors. Your job is simple. Maintain power grid integrity for Zone Echo 9. Don't ask questions about what's in Echo 9. Don't try to access Echo 9 without clearance. Don't discuss Echo 9 with anyone outside your assigned team. We drove for 20 minutes through terrain that looked like the surface of Mars. No roads, just tyre tracks in the sand. Finally, we reached what looked like a mining operation. Corrugated metal buildings, a few trucks, some kind of elevator shaft descending into the mountain. The elevator had no buttons, no controls, no floor indicator, just smooth steel walls and a humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The military escort, I never got his name, stood silent as we descended, and descended and descended, and I counted. 19 levels down, the elevator finally stopped. The doors opened onto a corridor that belonged in a science fiction movie. Polished white walls, LED strips running along the ceiling, and a silence so complete it felt oppressive. The air smelled like ozone and something else, something organic and wrong. 3 other contractors were waiting in what looked like a briefing room. Maria Santos, electrical engineer from Lockheed, Tom Brady, no relation to the quarterback he was quick to point out, systems analyst from Raytheon, and Jennifer Walsh, computer specialist whose previous work was so classified she couldn't tell us who she'd worked for. The briefing was conducted by a man who introduced himself only as Director Hayes, tall, grey-haired, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much and remembered everything. Ladies and gentlemen, you're here to maintain critical infrastructure for Project Chyros. What that project involves is not your concern. Your job is to ensure uninterrupted power flow to Zone Echo 9 and to report any anomalies immediately. Tom raised his hand. What kind of anomalies should we expect? Hayes stared at him for a long moment. The kind you don't ask questions about, Mr. Brady. He led us through a series of corridors to what he called the technical sector. Banks of monitors, server racks and control panels that looked like they belonged on a spaceship. At the centre of it all was a massive power distribution hub feeding something deeper in the complex. Zone Echo 9 requires constant power, Hayes explained. Any interruption longer than 30 seconds triggers automatic lockdown procedures. You don't want lockdown procedures to trigger. Why? Jennifer asked. Hayes looked at her the same way he'd looked at Tom. Because, Miss Walsh, lockdown procedures have never been tested, and we'd prefer to keep it that way. My shift started at midnight. The night crew was just me and Jennifer. Maria and Tom worked days. The complex felt different at night. Sounds carried farther. Shadows seemed deeper, and there was a vibration in the floor so subtle you might miss it if you weren't paying attention. But I was always paying attention. The power readings for Echo 9 were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The zone was drawing nearly a megawatt continuously, but the consumption patterns were irregular. Spikes and valleys that followed no logical sequence. It reminded me of a heartbeat, if heartbeats could be measured in kilowatts. Jennifer was monitoring the security feeds from her station, 12 screens showing various corridors and rooms throughout the complex. But I noticed something odd about the Echo 9 feeds. They had a 6-second delay. Every other camera was real-time, but the Echo 9 feeds looped the same 6 seconds over and over. Hey Jen, you seeing this camera glitch? She looked up from her work. What glitch? I pointed to the monitor. Echo 9, camera 7, it's looping. She frowned, typed something into her console. System shows all cameras functioning normally. I could see it. The same security guard walking past the same door at the exact same moment, every 6 seconds. Like a GIF that never quite loaded properly. On my 3rd night, the temperature started fluctuating. The complex maintained a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit, but my workstation kept shifting between freezing and sweltering. I checked the HVAC systems, all normal, but something was wrong. That's when I first saw the symbols. They were etched into the side of a server rack, symbols that definitely hadn't been there the night before. They looked almost like circuit diagrams, but wrong. Organic. Like someone had tried to draw electronics using biological principles. I was examining them with a flashlight when I heard Jennifer gasp. Cal, you need to see this. One of the Echo 9 corridor feeds had changed. Instead of the looping security guard, it showed an empty hallway. And at the end of that hallway, a door that was slowly opening. That door's not supposed to open, Jennifer whispered. Through the opening we could see movement. Not walking movement, flowing movement. Like liquid light was pouring through the doorway. Then the feed cut to black. When it came back 30 seconds later, it was the same looping security guard, walking past the same closed door. But in that brief moment, I had seen something that changed everything. In the reflection on the polished floor just before the feed died, I saw an eye. Massive, silver, and definitely not human. It wasn't a ship in Echo 9, it was alive, and it had seen us watching. Tom Brady didn't show up for his shift on Thursday morning. Jennifer and I waited until 8 a.m. before calling Director Hayes. Mr. Brady has been reassigned, Hayes said without explanation. Continue your duties. But Tom's personal effects were still in the break room. His coffee mug was still half full. His jacket was draped over his chair like he'd just stepped out for a moment. Maria started acting strange that afternoon. She kept muttering to herself, checking the same readouts over and over. When I asked if everything was okay, she looked at me like she didn't recognise me for a moment. "The numbers don't add up," she said. "We're feeding Echo 9 enough power to run a small city, but the thermal output is all wrong. It's like the energy is going somewhere else." "Somewhere else like where?" "Somewhere else like not here." That night the emergency sirens started blaring at 2:17 a.m, deafening klaxons that made your teeth ache. Jennifer and I looked at each other in panic. Was this the lockdown Hayes had warned us about? Then, as suddenly as they'd started, the sirens stopped. Not gradually, they just cut off mid-wail, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the noise. Director Hayes appeared in our control room 5 minutes later, looking shaken but trying to hide it. "False alarm," he said. "Continue your duties." But I noticed he wouldn't make eye contact, and his hands were trembling. The next day, Maria didn't show up either. Reassigned, according to Hayes. But her car was still in the parking structure on level 2. Jennifer was barely holding it together. We were the only contractors left, and the weight of whatever was happening in Echo 9 was crushing both of us. She started accessing systems she wasn't supposed to touch, using admin passwords she shouldn't have known. "Jen, what are you doing?" "Finding answers," she said, fingers flying over the keyboard. "Tom gave me his access codes before he disappeared, told me something was wrong with the whole project." She pulled up internal communications, memoranda stamped with classification levels I'd never seen before. Umbra Clear was apparently the bottom tier. Above that was Majestic, then Zodiac, then classifications that were just numbers and symbols. One document caught my attention. Project Chyros, Phase 3 Implementation Status. The bioconductive interface has exceeded all expectations. Subject demonstrates rapid adaptation to containment protocols and has begun influencing local electromagnetic fields. Recommend immediate escalation of consciousness mapping procedures. Bioconductive interface. Subject. The thing in Echo 9 wasn't a ship or a piece of technology, it was a living being, and we were feeding it power. Another document, dated 3 days earlier. Minor containment fluctuation at 0217 hours. Subject achieved brief sensory extension beyond Echo 9 barriers. Security protocols held, but recommend enhanced isolation measures. Note: 3 personnel reported temporal displacement sensations during the event. Temporal displacement, the looping camera feeds, the missing contractors. Jennifer kept digging, and what she found made both of us understand why Tom and Maria had really vanished. A memo marked Operation Mirror Veil, historical context. Analysis of recovered materials suggests extradimensional rather than extraterrestrial origin. Entities exist outside linear temporal experience and demonstrate ability to manipulate local space-time fabric. Primary subject may not be an individual organism, but rather a projection or echo of a larger consciousness existing in parallel dimensional space. They weren't from another planet, they were from outside reality itself. Warning: prolonged exposure to subject may result in consciousness fragmentation, temporal perception anomalies, and in extreme cases complete displacement from baseline reality. Personnel experiencing symptoms should report immediately for neural recalibration. Neural recalibration. That's what happened to Tom and Maria. They hadn't been reassigned. They'd been broken by contact with whatever was in Echo 9. Jennifer was reading over my shoulder, her breathing getting faster and more shallow. "Cal," she whispered, "look at the date on this document." It was dated 6 months in the future. The older archives were stored in a vault I wasn't supposed to access, but Jennifer's hacking skills were getting desperate and creative. She'd found references to something called Operation Mirror Veil, a predecessor to Project Chyros that dated back to the 1970s. The files told a story that made my blood run cold. In 1978, a survey team at Tonopah detected unusual seismic activity. Not earthquakes, but something else. Tremors that seemed to follow mathematical patterns. Ground-penetrating radar revealed an anomalous void approximately 200 feet beneath the mountain, but when they drilled down to investigate, they found something impossible. The void was bigger on the inside than on the outside. The first recovery team brought back samples of what they thought was exotic matter, materials that didn't conform to known physics, but the materials weren't stable in our reality. They flickered in and out of existence, sometimes vanishing for hours before reappearing in a different location. That's when they realized they weren't dealing with alien technology. They were dealing with something that existed between dimensions, using our reality as an anchor point. The breakthrough came in 1983 when Dr. Elena Vasquez, a theoretical physicist working on Project Looking Glass, hypothesized that the entity was a reflection of human consciousness itself, not what we are, but what we could become if we existed outside the constraints of linear time and three-dimensional space. The entity demonstrates knowledge of events that have not yet occurred, and memories of possibilities that may never happen. It exists in a state of quantum superposition, experiencing all potential outcomes simultaneously. In effect, it is us, evolved beyond the limitations of singular timeline existence. But the most disturbing file was Dr. Vasquez's final report, dated just days before her own mysterious disappearance. The entity is not malevolent, but it is incompatible with baseline human consciousness. Contact results in expansion of awareness beyond what the human mind can process. Subjects begin perceiving multiple timelines simultaneously, experiencing past and future as present reality. The mind fractures under the weight of infinite possibility. We are not studying an alien intelligence, we are studying our own future, and that future is trying to communicate with us across dimensions we cannot comprehend. Recommendation: immediate cessation of all contact protocols. The entity's attempts at communication are causing reality fluctuations that may result in permanent temporal displacement of personnel. It is not trying to harm us, it is trying to save us, but salvation from its perspective means joining it in its multidimensional existence. We are not ready. Humanity is not ready. Perhaps we never will be. The final line of her report chilled me to the bone. They are not invaders, they are echoes of what we already were. Jennifer found Dr. Vasquez's personal logs hidden in an encrypted partition that should have been impossible to access. The encryption was 40 years old, but somehow the files were updating themselves in real time. Day 1. First direct communication attempt. Entity projects images directly into visual cortex. I see myself, but not myself. Versions of Elena Vasquez that exist in parallel timelines. In one, I never became a physicist. In another, I died in childhood. In a third, I am something that transcends human categorization entirely. Day 3. Time displacement events increasing. Experienced memories of conversations that haven't happened yet. Entity is teaching me to perceive beyond linear causality. It's beautiful and terrifying. Day 7. I understand now. They're not from there, because there is no there. They exist in the spaces between possibilities. They are what we become when we evolve beyond the need for singular reality. Day 12. The others don't understand. They think containment is possible, that we can study and control something that exists outside the concept of control. They're going to get people killed. Day 18. I can see the breach coming. 3 days from now, the entity will attempt to return to its dimensional matrix, but our containment protocols will interfere with the translation. The resulting paradox will create a reality fissure. I have to stop them, but I may already be too late. Time isn't working properly anymore. I keep experiencing this moment from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The logs ended there, but they were still updating. New entries appeared as we watched. Day 7305, still trying to warn them. Elena variants across multiple timelines attempting intervention. Breach inevitable. Cal Monroe will survive, but survival is relative when reality becomes negotiable. Jennifer and I stared at the screen in horror. Dr. Vasquez had been missing for 40 years, but somehow she was still writing reports. That's when the lights went out. Not gradually, they snapped off like someone had thrown a switch. Emergency lighting should have kicked in immediately, but we were left in absolute darkness. The only sound was the humming of the power grid, and even that was changing pitch, becoming something organic and musical. Then Jennifer screamed. I fumbled for my flashlight and found her standing rigid, staring at something I couldn't see. Her eyes were wide and silver, reflecting light that wasn't there. "Cal," she whispered, but her voice sounded like it was coming from multiple directions at once. "It's getting out." The corridor behind us was changing. The walls were flowing like water, stretching and contracting, and through the shifting architecture something was moving, not walking, sliding, like liquid mercury with purpose. I grabbed Jennifer's arm, but my hand passed through her. She was there, but not solid, flickering between dimensions like the exotic matter from the old files. "Run," she said, and her voice was fading. "It's not trying to hurt us, but we can't exist in the same space when the boundaries collapse." The entity emerged from Echo 9, and my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It wasn't silver or liquid or light. It was all of those things and none of them. It was possibility given form, consciousness without the limitations of physical existence. But looking at it directly was like staring into a mirror that showed you every version of yourself that had ever existed, or ever could exist. I saw Cal Monroe the child, Cal Monroe the old man, Cal Monroe who had never been born, Cal Monroe who had become something beyond human understanding. The security guards were there one moment and gone the next, not killed, but displaced. I watched them step backward through walls that had become permeable, their screams echoing from distances that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. I ran, down corridors that folded in on themselves, past rooms that were bigger inside than outside, through a facility that was reshaping itself according to rules I couldn't comprehend. My watch was recording everything on its built-in camera, military-grade equipment designed to function in electromagnetic interference. If I survived, at least there would be proof, if survival had any meaning when reality itself was in question. I found an elevator, the same elevator I'd taken down 19 levels, except now it was in a corridor that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. The button panel was melting and reforming, showing floor numbers that shifted between digits and symbols and sometimes weren't there at all. But it was the only way up. The elevator rose with the same smooth hum as before, but when the doors opened, I was back in the same corridor I'd just left. Same melting walls, same impossible geometry, same feeling that I was being watched by something that existed in more dimensions than I could perceive. I tried again. Same result. And again, same corridor. The entity wasn't trying to trap me, it was trying to communicate, but communication required shared reference points, and we had none. Its attempts to make contact were causing reality to loop, creating temporal echoes that reflected my own desperation back at me. I was experiencing the same moment from multiple timelines simultaneously, just like Dr. Vasquez had described. In one timeline, I was still at my workstation, watching the power readings spike. In another, I had never taken the job. In a third, I was something else entirely, something that could perceive the entity without fracturing. But in this timeline, the one where I was still human, I was trapped in a loop between the 19th floor and somewhere that had no floor number at all. My watch battery was dying, but I kept recording. If someone found the footage, maybe they could understand what had happened. Maybe they could learn from our mistake. I sat down in the corridor that kept changing around me and tried to make sense of the past week. The missing contractors, the looping security feeds, the symbols that appeared and disappeared. It had all been the entity trying to communicate across dimensional barriers. Tom and Maria hadn't been reassigned. They'd been translated, shifted into a version of reality where they could coexist with something that existed outside linear time. They were still alive, but not in any way that baseline humanity could recognize. The entity appeared again, flowing through the wall like mercury through a membrane. But this time, instead of the overwhelming multiplicity of its full presence, it showed me a single image. Doctor. Elena Vasquez. Not as she had been 40 years ago, but as she was now, existing simultaneously across multiple timelines, still trying to warn people about a breach that was both inevitable and had already happened. She looked at me with eyes that held infinite sadness and spoke with a voice that echoed from past and future simultaneously. "You're already out, Cal, but you haven't left." Then the corridor collapsed into itself and everything went dark. Document recovered from the personal effects of Inspector Marcus Webb, Department of Defense Special Investigations Unit, following his death by apparent suicide in 2025. Classification level UMBRACLEAR/EYESONLY. Inspector Webb's final report dictated to voice recorder. "I've been investigating disappearances at classified facilities for 15 years. Missing persons, equipment failures, cover-ups, it's all part of the job. But the Cal Monroe case is different. The official story is that Mr. Monroe was killed in an industrial accident at Tonopah Test Range on March 18th, 2024. Electrical fire, they said. Nothing recoverable. But 3 days ago, a package arrived at my office with no return address. Inside was a storage device, military grade, designed to survive electromagnetic pulses and extreme temperatures. the kind of thing that costs more than my annual salary. Attached was a note. Zone Echo 9 debrief Cal Monroe. I've watched the footage 17 times now. I've had it analysed by the best experts available. They all say the same thing. It's impossible to fake. The metadata confirms it was recorded at Tonopah on the dates in question. But the content, the footage shows a man running through corridors that shift and change like living tissue. It shows walls flowing like water and shadows that move independently of any light source. It shows something that my mind keeps trying to rationalise as special effects or hallucination, but the technical analysis proves otherwise. And at the end, God help me. At the end of the footage, there's a moment where Monroe turns the camera on himself. He's standing in what appears to be an elevator that's somehow larger inside than outside. His face is calm, resigned as he speaks directly into the lens. If you're watching this, then the loop finally broke. I'm uploading this to the emergency buffer in my boot drive. Maybe someone will find it. Maybe someone will understand. Then he turns the camera back toward the corridor and there's something there. Something that doesn't belong in our reality. For just a moment it's visible, a reflection of consciousness itself, existing in dimensions we can't perceive. But here's what's keeping me awake at night. In that final frame, just before the recording ends, you can see Monroe's reflection in the polished wall behind him. And standing next to his reflection, clear as day, is another figure. It's me, Inspector Marcus Webb, wearing the same clothes I'm wearing right now, staring directly into the camera with an expression of absolute terror. The timestamp on that footage is today's date. I'm going to submit this report and then take some time off. Maybe visit my sister in Oregon, get away from all this classified nonsense for a while, clear my head. But I keep thinking about what Monroe said in his final log entry. They're not from somewhere else, they're from someone else, and someone else is now. End of recorded statement. Inspector Webb was found dead in his office 12 hours after submitting this report. Official cause of death, suicide by gunshot. Unofficial note, the security cameras in his office show him alone at the time of death, but the audio pickup clearly records two distinct voices. The second voice, according to forensic analysis, matches the vocal patterns of Cal Monroe. The storage device mentioned in Webb's report was never recovered from the scene. Zone Echo 9 remains operational. 3 months later, deep space monitoring stations began detecting an unusual signal, a transmission that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. When decoded, it contained a single message, repeating endlessly, "This is Cal Monroe, contractor ID 7749, reporting from Zone Echo 9. The breach has been contained, but containment is relative when dealing with entities that exist outside linear causality. To anyone receiving this transmission, Area 52 is not a place. It's a state of being, and that state is contagious. If you're investigating disappearances at classified facilities, stop. If you're experiencing temporal displacement sensations, seek help immediately. If you're reading reports about Project Chyros or Operation Mirror Veil, you may already be compromised. The entity isn't hostile. It's trying to save us from ourselves by showing us what we could become. But evolution forced upon consciousness that isn't ready results in fracturing of identity across multiple timelines. I'm still here, I'm always here. Time isn't working properly anymore, so here and there and when don't mean what they used to mean. To my family, I'm sorry I can't come home. Home is a temporal location, and I exist in all temporal locations simultaneously now. To the researchers, stop trying to contain what cannot be contained. The entity doesn't want to invade our reality, it wants to invite us into its own. But the invitation is dangerous because we're not ready to exist outside singular timeline experience. To future investigators, the truth about Area 52 isn't hidden underground in Nevada. It's hidden in the spaces between moments, in the gaps between what is and what could be. And sometimes, if you know how to look, you can see those gaps opening. This is Cal Monroe signing off from everywhere and nowhere. Take care of each other. Trust me when I tell you that love is the only thing that exists consistently across all timelines. See you around. Or maybe I already have. Tonight, I'll be your guide on a journey into one of the coldest and most enduring mysteries of the Cold War era. I want you to picture this. It's a winter night deep in the Ural Mountains, 1959. A group of young adventurers huddles in a tent on the snowy slope of a peak ominously called Dead Mountain. They're laughing, jotting down journal entries by flashlight, and planning tomorrow's trek. They don't know it yet, but this will be their last night alive. This is the true story of the Diatlov Pass incident, a mystery that has haunted investigators for decades. My name is James, and I've spent weeks poring over old case files, diaries, and witness reports about what happened to those 9 hikers in 1959. The more I dig, the more the Diatlov Pass incident feels like a nightmare straddling the line between fact and fiction. So, let's delve into it together step by step as if we're investigators unravelling a case file. The story begins in late January 1959. 10 experienced ski hikers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute set out on an expedition to reach a mountain called a Torten in the northern Urals. They were all in their early 20s, 7 men and 2 women, except for one older instructor, and were led by a 23-year-old radio engineering student named Igor Diatlov. On January 23, 1959, the Diatlov group received their route book and left the city of Sverdlovsk, today's Yekaterinburg, by train. You can imagine them on that train, excited, full of youthful bravado, maybe singing along to a mandolin one of them brought for the journey. After 2 days on trains, the party reached Ivdel, a remote town at the edge of the northern Ural Mountains, which also housed a Soviet Gulag camp for criminals. From Ivdel, they travelled by bus and then hitched a ride in the back of a woodcutter's truck to a settlement called Vizhai, the last inhabited village to the north. The locals in Vizhai must have looked at these university students with a mix of admiration and concern. The route they planned to traverse was rated Category 3, the most difficult, and they were attempting it in February, the cruelest time of year. On January 27th, the Diatlov group left Vizhai and began their trek into the wilderness. One member, Yuri Yudin, had been struggling with health issues. He had rheumatism and a congenital defect that caused knee pain. By January 28th, Yudin's joint pain became too severe. Reluctantly, he turned back toward Vizhai, unable to continue. He had no idea that by saving himself, he was sealing his fate as the expedition's sole survivor. Yuri Yudin would never see his friends alive again. The remaining 9 hikers pressed on into the wild, unaware of the fate that awaited them. Through diaries and photographs recovered later, investigators have pieced together their route. By January 31st, the group had reached the edge of a highland area and cached surplus food and equipment in a wooded valley to be used for the return trip. They joked around, took photos, and even made a little mock newspaper they titled The Evening Autoten, in which one entry humorously proclaimed, "From now on, we know that the snowmen exist," likely a tongue-in-cheek reference to local Yeti legends. Despite the exhaustion and cold, their spirits were high. On February 1st, the team started to move through a mountain pass, later named Diatlov Pass after this incident, with the plan to camp on the other side that night. But the weather turned on them. A howling snowstorm and blinding wind caused Diatlov's team to lose their direction on the barren slopes. Instead of crossing the pass into the shelter of the valley beyond, they had veered west, finding themselves on the flank of a mountain called Kholat Shakal, which in the local Mansi language means Dead Mountain. By the time they realised their mistake, it was late in the day, and visibility was near zero from the blowing snow. Rather than descend 1.5 kilometres down into the forest for cover, Igor Diatlov decided to pitch their tent right there on the mountainside in the open. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they'd gained, or perhaps he wanted to prove they could handle camping on an exposed slope in a blizzard. The 9 of them set up their large tent on the bare snow, chopping into the slope for a flat spot. It was a decision that would be heavily scrutinised later. That evening of February 1st, 1959 must have been brutal. Temperatures were around minus 20 degrees Celsius, and winds roared over the pass. Still, inside the tent, the group was relatively secure. They had a warm dinner. Later forensic analysis of their stomach contents showed they ate around 6 to 7 p.m. In one of the last photos recovered from their cameras, they are seen joking and smiling as they set up camp in the twilight on February 1st. Despite the extreme cold and howling wind outside, they seemed in good spirits, jotting down journal entries and chatting as they settled in for the night. They could not have imagined the terror that was coming. Something happened in the dark early hours of February 2nd that changed everything. We don't have eyewitnesses to describe it. All we have is the evidence left behind, and that evidence reads like the opening scene of a horror film. Sometime after midnight, the tent was suddenly slashed open from the inside. The 9 campers, who had been sleeping or resting, burst out of their tent into a howling snowstorm in the pitch black of night. They left behind almost all their gear, boots, coats, hats, sleeping bags, axes, as if fleeing an imminent threat. Imagine the situation. It's minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, outside, and yet something scared or startled them so badly that they ran out half-dressed and barefoot into the blizzard. Why? What could have terrified them, or otherwise compelled them to abandon their only shelter and run into certain death? That's the question investigators have grappled with for over 60 years. When the group failed to return to Vijay by February 12th as planned, there wasn't immediate alarm. Delays of a few days were common for such expeditions. But as day after day passed with no word, the hikers' families grew anxious. By February 20th, the relatives demanded a search and rescue operation. The Ural Polytechnic Institute sent student volunteers to scour the route, and soon the Soviet army and local militia police joined in, with planes and helicopters dispatched to aid the search. Rescuers faced brutal weather themselves, traversing deep snow and scanning miles of desolate terrain. Among the searchers was a student named Mikhail Sharavin, who on February 26th would make a chilling discovery. On February 26th, 1959, Sharavin's search team was moving along the slopes of Kolatchakal when he spotted something odd sticking out of the snow. As they got closer, they realised it was a corner of the missing group's tent, collapsed and half buried in the snow. Sharavin used an ice pick to hack open the tent's entrance, which was blocked with snow. The sight inside the tent baffled him. The tent's canvas had been slashed open from the inside with a knife, and although it was damaged and partially snow-filled, almost all the hikers' belongings were still neatly arranged inside. He found blankets and coats laid out, a row of boots, axes and flashlights set to the sides, a map and official papers, a little pile of money and even a flask of alcohol. In one corner was a plate with slices of sayalo, pork fat, as if someone had been in the middle of fixing a snack. It was like a snapshot frozen in time. The tent felt orderly, not like it had been ripped apart by an external force. Sharavin later said it was as if the campers had been interrupted in the middle of dinner, then fled in a rush. The scene sent shivers down his spine. Why would experienced hikers cut open their only shelter and run away without boots or coats? Outside the tent, the search team found footprints in the snow, and they only deepened the mystery. There were 9 sets of prints, which matched the number of missing hikers. They could see the impressions of feet wearing only socks, or a single shoe, and some barefoot. You could even make out toe marks in the frozen snow. The tracks indicated that the hikers had not run in a wild panic, but rather walked fast or at a hurried shuffle down the slope, in an organised single file. The rescuers followed these tracks downhill in the direction of a dense forest. Incredibly, the footprints continued for about 500 metres before they were obscured by fresh snow. It was as if the group had intentionally headed toward the forest, perhaps seeking shelter or regrouping. Sharavin and the others were utterly perplexed. What on earth could have made these seasoned hikers leave their tent in sub-zero cold, partially dressed and even barefoot, walking away calmly into the night? With dusk approaching on February 26th, the searchers had to pause the search until morning, haunted by the enigma they'd uncovered. The next day, the search parties fanned out from the tent down toward the forest. At the forest's edge, under a large Siberian cedar tree, Sharavin and his comrades found the charred remains of a small fire. Near that fire lay the first 2 bodies. What they saw defied explanation. Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy, Yuri Krivonishenko, were found side by side in the snow, shoeless and dressed only in their underwear. The branches on the cedar above them were broken up to 5 meters high, as if someone had climbed up into the tree. Indeed, bits of skin and torn clothing were found on the bark. It looked like one of them had frantically clambered up the cedar, either to get a better view of the area, perhaps trying to spot the tent in the dark, or to escape something. Krivonishenko's corpse had burns on parts of his body, and in a grim detail he had a piece of flesh missing from his right hand. It turned out he had bitten off a chunk of his own knuckle, possibly in an attempt to stay conscious or stifle a scream while dying of cold. Both men's hands and feet were deep reddish-brown, a sign of frostbite, and maybe the last attempt to warm their limbs by the fire. The tree's branches had been stripped for kindling, but the fire they managed to build was small and had burned out by the time they died. The image of these two friends huddled by a dead fire, slowly freezing to death in their underwear under a sky of endless black, is something I can't easily shake off. About 300 meters away from the cedar tree, toward the tent, the searchers found the body of Igor Diatlov. He was lying face up in the snow, head oriented toward the tent up the slope, as if he had been trying to crawl back that way. Diatlov was better dressed than the two under the tree. He wore a flannel shirt, a sweater, and pants, but notably, he had no coat and no boots, only socks on his feet. One arm was frozen upright, reaching toward the sky, clutching a small birch branch. His other hand was pressed to his chest. People who saw his body remarked that he appeared to be protecting something in his jacket or close to his heart. Perhaps a photograph or his notebook, though nothing of note was found on his chest. His face, when they cleared the snow, was strangely calm, eyes open. Not far from Diatlov, searchers found Zenaida Zina Kolmogorova, the 22-year-old female student in the group. Zina was better dressed than Igor. She had on 2 sweaters and 2 pants, but she too lacked boots, wearing only socks. Her body was turned toward the tent and her arms were extended forward, bent at the elbows, as if she had been crawling uphill on her stomach, desperately trying to get back to the tent before the cold overtook her. On Zina's right side, the searchers noted a long, bright red bruise running along her torso, resembling a blunt force injury from a baton or the butt of a rifle. It was an odd injury to see, given that she had no other major external wounds. It took a few more days until March 5th to find Rustem Slobodin, the last of these first 5 bodies. Slobodin, 23, was discovered face down in the snow about 480 meters from the cedar, roughly halfway back toward the tent. He was dressed more warmly than the others. He had a long-sleeve undershirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, 4 pairs of socks, and 1 felt-lined boot on his right foot, but his head was bare and his left foot was only in a sock. In his right hand, Slobodin clenched a small pocket knife, closed. An autopsy would later reveal that Slobodin had a fracture in his skull, about 7 inches long, consistent with a blunt impact. However, this crack in his skull was not deemed a fatal wound. The medical examiner thought Rustem could have sustained it during a fall and continued moving for at least an hour afterward. Like Diatlov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko and Krivonishenko, Rustem Slobodin ultimately died of hypothermia. In fact, the first 5 bodies found all had no life-threatening external injuries. They had perished from the unforgiving cold. Slobodin's watch was found shattered and stopped at 8:45, though it's unclear if that was 8:45 a.m. or p.m, or even 8:45 on a different date. It was as if time itself froze at that moment. Now imagine being Yuri Yudin, the one who had turned back, called in to identify the bodies of your friends. One by one, the first 5 corpses were airlifted to the morgue in Ivdel for autopsy and identification. Yudin, with a heavy heart, confirmed their identities. But 4 members of the Diatlov party were still missing. Weeks passed with no sign of them. The winter snows began to melt under the early spring sun. It wasn't until May, nearly 3 months later, that nature revealed the remaining victims, turning the mystery into something even more haunting. On May 4th, a Mansi tribesman named Kurin and his dog were assisting the search, when the dog picked up a scent near a rocky ravine further into the woods from the cedar tree. About 75 meters beyond the cedar and 1,500 meters from the tent, in a snow-filled ravine, searchers discovered a few torn pieces of clothing on a branch. Digging down, they uncovered the final 4 bodies buried under nearly 4 meters of snow. These were Lyudmila, Lyuda Dubinina, Semyon, Alexander, Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Alexander Kolevatov. They were lying about 75 meters further into the forest from the cedar, at the bottom of that ravine. Notably, 3 of the 4 were better dressed than the others, and it appeared they had taken clothes from those who died earlier. Dubinina, for example, was found wearing Krivonishenko's torn and burned brown trousers, and her foot was wrapped in a piece of his wool sweater. Zolotaryov, the 38-year-old, was found wearing Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat. Kolevatov had put on a spare sweater and pants, likely from one of the others. This exchange of clothing suggests that when some members of the group died, the last survivors stripped the dead of usable clothing to keep themselves alive, a tragic but practical act of survival. But the condition of these 4 bodies deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Unlike the first 5, 3 of these 4 had fatal physical injuries that were utterly horrifying. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture. His skull was literally crushed, the fracture measuring about 8 inches. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryov both had their chests caved in, with multiple ribs broken on each side. Dubinina had 10 ribs fractured, and Zolotaryov had 5 ribs fractured. A forensic doctor who examined the bodies said that the force required to produce such injuries would have been extremely high, comparable to that of a car crash. In other words, something had delivered an immense pressure or impact to their bodies. Strangely, none of these 3 had any external wounds or bruises corresponding to the lethal internal damage. It was as if they'd been hit by a shockwave or squeezed by a tremendous force without breaking the skin. The 4th person in the ravine, Alexander Kolevatov, had a less clear cause of death. He had a broken nose, an open wound behind his ear, and a deformed neck, but his injuries were not as catastrophic as the others. It's believed Kolevatov also died of hypothermia, possibly after sustaining some trauma. And then there were the gruesome details that truly made this case infamous. All 4 of these people in the ravine had some form of soft tissue damage to the head and face that wasn't seen in the others. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips, and even a bit of her skull bone. Semyon Zolotaryov was missing his eyeballs, and Alexander Kolevatov was missing his eyebrows. These shocking injuries naturally gave rise to lurid theories. Was the group attacked by someone or something that ripped out tongues and eyes? However, the medical experts had a more mundane explanation. The 4 in the ravine were found in a stream bed. During the 3 months before they were found, water and scavenging animals likely caused the soft tissue of their faces to decompose or be eaten away. In Dubinina's case, the autopsy noted that her stomach contained about 100 grams of coagulated blood, suggesting her heart was still beating when her tongue was removed, meaning the tongue likely decomposed or was scavenged very soon after her death. As horrifying as these injuries sound, investigators believe they were post-mortem effects, not violence inflicted while alive. Still, when these details became public, they fueled wild speculation about murderous attackers or supernatural evil. It didn't help that Zolotaryov was found with a camera around his neck, different from the other cameras found in the tent, and his hand holding a pen and notepad, as if he died trying to write something down. Unfortunately, whatever he intended to note was never written. The pad was blank. The investigators in 1959 were at a loss to come up with a satisfying explanation for all this. A criminal inquest began as a matter of procedure, since several of the deaths involved injuries. They first suspected that the native Manatee people, reindeer herders of the region, might have attacked the campers for trespassing on sacred land. But that theory was quickly dispelled. The only footprints found at the scene were those of the hikers themselves, and there were no signs of hand-to-hand struggle on the bodies. In fact, the Mansi had helped in the search, and had no history of hostile encounters with hikers. Next, investigators considered an avalanche, but the pattern of the tent and the footprints suggested otherwise. We'll revisit that later. As for animal attack, no large animal tracks were found, and the violent injuries didn't have the telltale marks of claws or teeth. The Soviet authorities were left to conclude that no other humans were involved in the Diatlov group's demise. One of the doctors famously commented that the force which killed Dubinina and Zolotaryov was more than any human could inflict. No human could be powerful enough to cause such damage. One piece of information emerged that added a strange Cold War twist. When the forensic analysts tested the hikers' clothing, they found unusual levels of radiation on some of the garments. Specifically, Dubinina's brown sweater and Krivonishenko's wool pants were found to be radioactive. This discovery didn't make sense in a hiking context, and was not something the average person could detect. It was only found because one investigator had access to a Geiger counter. The presence of radiation fueled speculation that the Diatlov party had encountered some secret weapon or radioactive fallout. However, a closer look provided a more ordinary explanation. Yuri Krivonishenko had previously worked at the Mosyak nuclear facility and was involved in cleaning up a major nuclear accident in 1957, the Kishtim disaster. It's very possible his clothes were contaminated from that event and still carried traces of radiation. Likewise, Alexander Kolevatov had studied nuclear physics and worked at a secret institute in Moscow, which might explain contamination on some items. In short, the radiation might not have had anything to do with the incident. It could have been a red herring. Still, the fact that their skin reportedly had a deep tan, and some of their hair had turned grey when relatives saw the bodies only intensified rumours of some nuclear or chemical exposure. Authorities claimed the skin tanning was a natural mummification effect from lying in the sun and cold for weeks, and that hair can turn colour from exposure or the embalming process. But to grieving families in 1959, radioactive clothes and orange skin sounded like the stuff of government cover-ups and sci-fi nightmares. By May 1959, the official investigation was drawing to a close without a concrete answer. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, was under pressure to wrap it up. In his final report, Ivanov wrote that the hikers died because of the effect of an unknown compelling force. It was a vague catch-all phrase, essentially admitting that they couldn't figure it out. No external culprits could be identified, and the case was therefore closed without any criminal charges. The files were stamped secret and filed away in a Soviet archive. The Diatlov Pass area was also declared off-limits to other expeditions for the next 3 years, supposedly to prevent any more tragedies, though some see it as an attempt to keep curious eyes away. The inquest's official finding was that the group members died due to a compelling natural force, a phrase that raised more questions than it answered. Imagine the weight of that silence. 9 young lives lost, and their families were told they would never know exactly how or why. In the Soviet Union of 1959, that was that. Some of the parents and siblings sensed a cover-up. Zina Kolmogoreva's mother, for instance, and Igor Diatlov's parents all received hushed warnings from officials. The families were explicitly told, "You will never know the truth, so stop asking questions." In those days, if the party or KGB told you to be quiet, you stayed quiet, out of fear. So the families buried their children without knowing what really happened, and the Diatlov incident faded into an eerie Cold War legend whispered about in Ural classrooms and mountaineering clubs. As for Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor who wasn't even there, he lived the rest of his life with survivor's guilt and a burning desire to find the truth. Yudin repeatedly insisted that his friends did not die due to some simple natural accident. He felt in his gut that something else, something man-made, had to have caused it. In interviews before his death in 2013, Yuri Yudin openly voiced his belief that the Soviet authorities knew more than they let on about the incident. In fact, not long before he died, Yudin publicly stated that he believed his teammates had been taken out of the tent at gunpoint and murdered. He even speculated that Dubinina's tongue was cut out by perpetrators because she was the most outspoken of the group. These are incredibly serious accusations, and they were never proven. Yudin admitted he had no evidence, just deep suspicions after a lifetime of thinking about it. Whether Yudin was right or wrong, his perspective shows just how deeply the Diatlov mystery can burrow into someone's soul. So, Here we are, decades later, with more questions than answers. I'm a modern-day investigator, combing through the remnants of old reports and new theories. As I piece together each bit of evidence, I feel that cold wind from Dead Mountain blowing through the decades. The Diatlov Pass incident has become one of the world's most enduring mysteries, precisely because it sits at the crossroads of the explicable and the baffling. Over the years, numerous theories have been put forward to explain it, some grounded in scientific reasoning, others veering into the paranormal or conspiratorial. Let's examine these theories one by one, like branching investigative paths, and see where each leads. Keep in mind, any good explanation must account for all the odd details we've discussed: the torn tent, the state of undress, the bizarre injuries, the radiation, the reports of strange lights in the sky, the secrecy. It's a tall order, but let's walk these paths together. The first path is the one that the Russian authorities themselves eventually settled on: an avalanche. For many, this is the most straightforward explanation. Picture the scenario. The Diatlov group is asleep in their tent on the slope, when suddenly a slab of heavy snow above them fractures and slides down onto the tent. The tent fabric begins to collapse and they hear the roar of snow. In a flash, the group panics. They believe a full avalanche is about to bury them. In seconds, they grab a knife, slash open the tent from the inside, because the entrance is blocked or hard to open under the weight of snow, and they flee into the night wearing whatever they had on at that moment. This theory gained significant traction, and in fact in 2019 to 2020 the Russian government reinvestigated Diatlov Pass and concluded that a slab avalanche was the official cause of death. Later that year, a team of scientists published new computer simulations supporting the plausibility of an avalanche. In this case, the most appealing aspect of the avalanche theory is that the hiker's actions no longer seem irrational under this lens. If you believe an avalanche is about to crush you, doing whatever it takes to get out of the tent and moving to safer ground is exactly the right response. And indeed, everything the Diatlov group did after leaving the tent can be seen as textbook survival behaviour once you assume an avalanche threat. The theory goes like this. A slab of snow, perhaps loosened by the wind or the heat from their stove earlier, slid and partially buried the tent, making loud cracks and rumbles. The experienced hikers immediately and calmly initiated an emergency evacuation. They cut their way out of the tent and headed for ground that would be safe from a larger avalanche, which in this case meant moving toward the tree line on the far side of the pass. They didn't take time to put on boots or grab equipment because every second mattered. In their minds, they had to get clear of the avalanche path. In just their socks and light clothes, they made it about a mile downslope to the forest. There they regrouped and tried to stay warm by building a fire. We saw evidence of that by the cedar. They also dug a snow cave as a shelter. The ravine where the last four were found had branches laid out on the floor,